I look forward to the opportunity to share a little bit about the space that I work in, which is in the built environment and in the post-fire environment space. And much of my research is really trying to focus on key lessons learned in the post-fire environment, focused on how buildings are vulnerable to fire, and also looking for opportunities to try and basically strengthen and build fire adaptation into the ways that we live. I'm going to talk about loss, and so my heart goes out to any of you, especially those of you recently in Southern California and Altadena and Palisades, or who know people in those communities who lost homes. I do recognize that through the work we're going to talk about today, some of it may evoke some emotion. So I want you to know that while this may seem impersonal at some level, it's really an opportunity to learn from what's happened in the past so that we can better inform the future. So what we're hoping to do today is help kind of detangle some of the exposures and pathways that wildfire travels, and help to bring forward an improved understanding of fuel and building vulnerability. And the ultimate goal is really to gain actionable ideas to both rethink and redesign some of our landscaping, as well as tie into maintenance overall in our landscaping to help think about ways that we can do so to reduce structure loss. And I really want to emphasize that my hope is that we can work with you all to communicate viable solutions for a fire adapted future, and really a sense of hope. I think through knowledge comes power, and I think so many folks right now feel overwhelmed by what has happened in California over the last decade. And so I hope that we can give you some thoughts and ideas, answer some of your questions about how to develop a pathway forward in this new fire environment that we're in. So thanks for your community service, thanks for your interest in being a master gardener, and thanks for all the work that you do in your communities. We really appreciate it and know how important you are as trusted messengers and as really solid community assets. So I'm going to start by talking about what is fuel. And the short answer is really it's anything that's combustible. And I'd like to just dive in a little bit to what is combustible. So starting in the upper left, here's an example of artificial turf. It is combustible, it's flammable, and it's certainly capable of carrying fire. I think we all recognize that cars and recreational vehicles often are parked near to our structures, and they are ignitable, but also are things like garbage cans, and they can have a lot of heat and energy stored in them. And so if you end up with an ignition, they can really help transmit the fire. Wood fences, pretty obvious. I think mulch is relatively self-explanatory, and it can be both of synthetic or wood-based products. The smaller the particle size, the easier it is to ignite. And so mulch near to buildings is quite vulnerable to spreading fire to the buildings itself. There's even other elements such as the hot tub shown on the left, which have unique vulnerabilities and again have a lot of stored energy in them. And unfortunately, in experimental research, we've been able to show that when the hot tub ignites, the water itself doesn't actually put the hot tub out. Sometimes it deploys it, or it falls out in another direction away from the part that's actually burning. So those items close to the structure also have unique vulnerabilities. We're talking about, plantings and gardening. And so just, kind of want to reinforce this idea of foundation plantings, hedges, and even vines on block walls. These are all sources of fuel, and they all can represent pathways for transmission of fire to the structure. So I'm going to start by a look at embers, and I think most of us are gaining familiarity with what these are. And these are pieces of burning material, often associated with the wildland and wildland vegetation. But at some point, as fire becomes closer or involved in our communities, it's embers that can come from our neighboring plants. It also can be parts of buildings as they combust and get picked up in the air column. So when you look at this image, I'd like you to tell me where the wind is coming from. There's a lot of fluid dynamics evident in this image, but there are some qualities about how the embers are moving that give an illustration of where the wind is coming from. Certainly you can see the eddying and the vortexing is shown on the left in this horizontal circulation pattern. You can also see the vertical pattern here around the second door, and that these patterns have something to do with the way the building is structured in relation to the direction of the wind. But the wind is actually coming from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the screen. And I can tell that because of this hot line here. You see this bright orange at the base of the wall behind this firefighter. And so what is happening is that the embers are actually moving from left to right, and they collide with this wall at any height and then fall to the base and collect at the base of the wall. And what that's done is basically transmitted fire directly to the structure. And because there is combustible mulch as well as some other vegetation in this location, we get an ignition point. And the concern really is that in the detail and the edge as to how that wall is finished, so going from the vertical to the horizontal, and whether that wall is capable of withstanding that type of fire exposure. In many cases, it's not, even with stucco construction. And so this becomes a very vulnerable location to fire. And so even if you have foundation plantings or other elements here, the wind can carry the embers at many different heights, and it will likely interact with these, strong protruding vertical surfaces and then drive the embers to the base of them. So this is one of the fundamental challenges, is trying to recognize what looks like fuel, how fire may be able to interact with that fuel, and where are we capable of extinguishing those fires, or where can we manage those fires more directly? So I want to talk about pathways and bring a couple of vocabulary terms forward. I think most of us are familiar with this idea of fire coming from somewhere else towards the structure. And we do defensible space work to basically interrupt that pathway. So as shown on the left, this concept of direct flame contact, where fire moves from somewhere else towards our structures, and it can move and be carried by a combination of surface and aerial fuels and connect through our plantings as well as what's in the wildland, leading to fire touching the structure. We just talked about embers, which are long distance transported material, which can go over those fuel breaks and other things. And embers can find ways into our structures through open windows, through skylights, through our vents, as well as other kind of unique vulnerabilities, creating opportunities for ignition right adjacent to the structure. So here is shown in the gutters, as well as the foundation plantings surrounding the building. And so addressing embers takes a multi-pronged approach that involves both fuel reduction as well as home hardening in general. And then I also want to talk about this lesser known concept called radiant heat, where you get an ignition in somewhere adjacent to the structure, here shown with an outbuilding, and the heat transfer from that adjacent combustible item is sufficient to cause a fail point in the primary structure, as illustrated here with the breaking of a glass window or the deformation of the vinyl that holds the window frame in, that can lead towards the panes falling out. So in the radiant heat case, it's about home hardening. It's about how do we harden the structure such that if you get an ignition of that adjacent structure, that wall or that exposed side of the building is more robust to fire overall. So really what I want to bring forward today is kind of this multiple pathways approach between direct flame contact, embers, and radiant heat, and try and help navigate through those to be able to more explicitly talk about where mitigations can happen, how we do that through defensive actions by fuel reduction, known as defensible space, as well as some elements associated with how we harden the structure. There's no one element. You can't just do fuel reduction. You can't just do home hardening alone. Both of those actions need to happen in tandem to be able to reduce the potential exposure from all these three types of fire possibilities. So to break it down, and this was inspired from some of the work I did in Altadena and Palisades. The idea is that we often get an ignition somewhere else. It can be lightning, it can be a power line, it can be, an escaped campfire. And what that leads to is a fire in the wildland, which starts moving through the vegetation. We often have events that have wind behind them, and that's where our crews and resources are more challenged because they're focused on evacuation as the primary and first response. So you get fire moving through the vegetation. At some point, it gets closer to our communities, whether they're wildland urban interface communities or even communities like Altadena and Palisades, where the fire transitions from the wildland to our near to home environment, sometimes through a wooden fence, sometimes through vegetation, and that allows that direct flame contact to run towards the structure. If there's wind behind it, as I was suggesting, you often get embers moving. Those embers then are getting moved long distances, sometimes as much as a mile or more, and they start to exploit vulnerabilities in the interiors of our communities. And we get ignition of buildings that are maybe far away from the ignition, from the initial flaming front. And there can be multiple pathways where you get multiple points of ignition happening simultaneously. Again, bringing other fences or other vegetation, allowing the fire to sort of wick along that fuse directly towards the structure. And then when you get structures ignited, you get a lot of radiant heat and you can get that house to house event. So what I'd like to do today is really talk about how we break those pathways and really can build in some more resilience into our communities. I'm going to start by just sharing a video from, I think this is Palisades here.
Halfway between the two buildings, you can see that the trees got involved and the trees led to a lot of heat exposure onto these windows. Here's where the window pane is on its way out because the glazing has melted. And you can see the breakage up there. These look to be annealed glass. I don't see the tempered glass bead, and you can tell by the way that the window is cracking. And then over here, the gate engaged.
So some of what I do is really kind of fire chase and follow the path of destruction to be able to look at opportunities like that, to be able to see kind of what was the pathway and what was happening in that example. So what I'm trying to bring forward is really this coupled approach where we're talking about vegetation and other combustibles on the property, their selection, their location, and their maintenance, really bringing forward a concept of right plant, right place, right care. And then again, thinking about the structure itself, its construction materials, its design features, and again, how do we maintain them? If I can give you any message today, there's no single building product that is 100% effective. Just because you have stucco siding or just because you have a metal roof, it takes more than those things. So those are great elements, but it takes more than that overall. So why do we have to change? And I know as master gardeners, there's a lot of conversation happening about changes in policy in California. And so I just really want to bring forward a couple thoughts here. At this point, structure loss is accelerating. At the time of this recording, we've lost in the last decade over 57,000 structures. That's a huge amount of people's lives just extinguished overnight. We're seeing that the fire season is really lengthening. Fires are happening throughout the year. They're occurring in all parts of California in a whole lot of different vegetation types. And we're seeing the same pattern time and time again. It's really these events where we get a lot of wind behind them that is really overloading the fire services system, and the focus becomes on protection of life and evacuation and less on structure protection, just because there's not sufficient resources, especially when we have multiple ignitions happening simultaneously in the state. And so, we have to really be thinking about what that means for us, and how can we be a reliable partner with the fire service during these really intense experiences. This has led to home and business insurance being heavily destabilized. And I think probably many of you in the room may have experienced either increases in premiums or loss overall, and limitations to the FAIR plan. And that's led to major community, environmental, and economic disruption across the state. We are seeing changes and signs of hope. For example, there are now exterior building codes for new construction, but most of California's buildings were built before 2008 when the codes were adopted. So we've got kind of competing goals right now. We've got homes built prior to the building codes. We've got warming conditions. We've got conditions that are exceeding fire personnel, both capacity and availability. We've got connected fuels. And then we've got, a regular periodicity of drought, limiting water availability and really leading towards water curtailment. At the same time, our communities want protection. They want safe evacuation and refuge areas. They want economic stabilization. We want affordable housing and more availability. And we also, have these strong water conservation targets. So this kind of puts master gardeners and us within the fire network kind of right in the middle of some really challenging conversations and, a need really to kind of understand and detangle some of these fire related challenges. So I think a lot of people think that it's a wall of flames that destroy the house when it's really just often embers that are the primary contributor. I think a lot of people also think that forest fires are what we need to be concerned about. Yet I want to share with you is that we lose more homes and fires that are in other vegetation types than forests, both nationally and at the state level. I think a lot of people think, well, wildfire doesn't happen here, or that we have a terrific fire service and that, it's not something they need to worry about. A lot of people also feel like, it's the neighbors that they should worry about and not themselves. And I just want to really promote the idea of like what's within your control. It's easier to control your own condition than it is your neighbors. I think a lot of people always think that they'll have the water to maintain the plants, to maintain conditions, and that they'll always be physically able to care for their yard. And, that's a hope and aspiration, but a lot of, things change in our lives, especially as we age. And then a great misnomer is many people think they'll be home when the fire starts and they can do those final last minute checklists and they can prepare their home and yard for the fire, which unfortunately is not always true. So, how do we kind of work through those false hopes and how do we think about this? So I just want to, really illustrate that more homes are burned in grass and shrublands than forests, and that's the national total. It's very similar to the state total. And so this idea that it's just a forest fire issue is just really not accurate. I think Smokey the Bear has been a fantastic educational campaign, but it's caused us to think about this in a forest only setting. And, look at Altadena and Palisades. These were not forest fires. These were fires of shrublands, and they moved into built communities. There's been a lot of evolution in how we talk about defensible space. Here's some graphic illustrations in 2006 when defensible space moved from just 0 to 30 feet to 30 to 100 feet. So it first came about in California in 1965, that 30-foot zone. 2006, it gets expanded to add an additional 70 feet of protection. And then now we're seeing the change with Zone 0 coming on board. But the graphic illustrations in 2006 really just reinforce this idea that it's a forest-related condition and we live in wood cabins in the woods, and just kind of continue to reinforce this message that it doesn't apply to all of California, when what we've seen is really not true. What defensible space has been about is really been about creating a defendable space so that it's a safe place for fire personnel to stage and be able to manage an approaching fire such that the fire might come out of the crown or the green part of the vegetation. It could be shrubs, it could also be tall trees as shown here, and it drops to the ground such that the flame heights are something that crews can directly attack. That's what defensible space has really largely been about. And what we're seeing now is a great modernization of that to really reflect a different set of conditions and this element associated with embers as well as radiant heat. So that's where this modernization is coming from, and that's where Zone 0 is coming from. So we're now seeing the movement of a 3-zone system, which focuses on the first 5 feet of the structure as Zone 0, and then from 5 to 25 feet is Zone 1 and working outwards. And it's really in this new look to really try and work from the home outwards, and trying to figure out how you get that win-win of privacy, security, beauty, and fire protection overall. So in the built structures, there are a lot of specific vulnerabilities, especially in roof to wall intersections, as well as the connected fences to the structure in our rain gutters, which collect water, but they also collect debris and embers, land and create ignition within those gutters. as well as the vents, which are really key to the circulation system of our structures overall. The vents, however, are quite porous and by design, especially to keep rodents out, but they can also let embers in. And so what you'll see is that we're really trying to promote this idea of a vent screen change from 1/4-inch mesh screen to 1/8-inch metal mesh screen so that it prevents the embers from getting inside of our structures. And this can be done through a variety of techniques, both adding existing screening to the vents you have now or upgrading to some new vents. In the home hardening priority space, there are 3 primary priorities that everyone should do no matter where you live. We all need a good roof. We all need the vents to be able to resist those embers. And we all need to be thinking about the vegetation and defensible space, especially close to the structures. There are some additional considerations when a building is on a steep slope or when structures are closer to each other, especially closer than 30 feet. And in that case, then the home hardening details associated with the windows and the siding really start to elevate in priority. There's more to talk about than I have time today, and there'll be some links that we can provide to you, especially if you look at our fire website, the Fire Network website, where we can give you more details about home hardening in general and how to think about the whole combination of actions to really increase the resistance of the structure to fire and fire exposures. But I want to just frame it, it's really a systems approach. And in this example, we've got a structure with combustible wood siding, and it's surrounded by some wood-based mulch. And what you can see is that we get ember ignition of that wood-based mulch, and that leads to both vertical and lateral spread of fire along the wall, and ultimately into fire into the attic. And so, we're trying to think about this in a whole systems viewpoint. If the mulch is gone, it's likely that the structure itself will not ignite. In post-fire work, there are a lot of examples of where all these pieces are coming together and buildings are being challenged in the most extreme conditions. Here's one from Boulder, Colorado. And this structure survived without fire suppression, and largely between the home hardening elements as well as that first 5 feet that did not transmit fire to the structure. So I'm just going to conclude here with some images from, this is one from Altadena, where you can see fire suppression took place. Here is a case where the fire was carrying in the landscaping around the structure. It ignited the wood fence. The fire then traveled down the wood fence. And then you can see where the gate itself was removed to keep the fire from transmitting to the structure. So here's an example of firefighter intervention in this case. Here are 2 more examples of vegetation adjacent to the structure. Both cases, there was firefighter intervention that prevented continued transmission. Here you can see the ignition point here. Here you can see the ignition point here. Both of these are examples of where, had someone not been there, I'm quite clear that both of these buildings would be fully destroyed. So, what about plants? I only have a few more minutes to kind of talk about that. Plant placement is more important than plant type. All plants can burn regardless of how they're marketed. It's really about their maintenance. Here's 2 illustrations of a shrub as well as a palm tree. And through maintenance, we can really change their overall condition. There's lots of interest in native and drought tolerant species. They're certainly important for resilience, but not necessarily any less resistant to fire overall. And so, let's talk about plant flammability really quickly. Why is it hard? And we've got a great piece of research by Beth Key, who's one of our UC colleagues, to look at plant flammability tests. And the problem is there's tons and tons of misnomers in this. There's lack of standardization. There's no standard test method. We're not clear if the test method is focused on ignition or flame spread or heat release. There's lots of confusing definitions. Many experiments use common names, and it's unclear which species were actually evaluated. And really, the care in the region matters substantially more. And so I just want to bring forward this idea of right plant, right place, right care. And the care is the really critical component in all of this. So some, visualizations of what this first 5 feet might look like, kind of an idea where we might be flip-flopping the walkways and the plantings so that we can, basically reduce that moat of flammability, of combustibility, of kindling that often is surrounding these buildings. And, giving some of that sense of still meeting the aesthetics, still meeting the privacy, all these kind of key features. And so just in conclusion, I showed you this slide earlier in the beginning, and it was talking about pathways and transitions. And what we're really trying to get to is thinking about how we can break the wick, how we could add perhaps a metal gate here so that if the fire comes to this direction, it's going to encounter a panel that's non-combustible and so won't transmit fire to the structure. How we can harden the structure overall so that if embers land, they really don't have a pathway in. How we can reduce the connectivity of fuels between structures and reduce the potential that we end up with ignition, and then from there that building to building spread. So through a few small actions, we're hoping that overall we can really start to change the outcome in our urban communities, in our rural communities, and in all of California so that we can build and maintain that more fire adapted future. So I'll just wrap up by saying, in my mind, there's tremendous reason for hope, and really that master gardeners are super important messengers in this space. And I hope that in this short amount of time, I've been able to help illustrate the fuel pathways and ways that we might be able to break the wick through, gate transitions, removing fuel adjacent to the structure, and really gardening in a way that islands of vegetation are disconnected from other islands of vegetation. So it's not just a continuous fuel bed that enables fire to move throughout the whole landscape and then directly to the building. And at the house level, we can try and fix some of those vulnerabilities that we can, understand what the importance is of the roof, the vents, and how we might upgrade windows where there's a radiant heat potential. So I'll close here with a final slide saying, I know that this is where many of us are living in an environment where we've got, what we have defined as a really beautiful aesthetic, but it shows the connectivity of this trellis, both wood and covered in vegetation, that there's these foundation plantings, and you can see they're already they're not fully hydrated in this condition here, and it's very easy for fire to land at the base of these foundation plantings and then follow this wick up of both the vegetation, the built structure, and then we've got fire directly on the structure. So that fire adapted future, I think, is one that's going to take some creativity, and I really hope that you'll join us in helping your communities think about what that can be for them and finding that win-win overall. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I will stop sharing and then answer some questions if I have a moment. So appreciate everyone. Let's see, Lauren, how do you
I
want
was
to take?
just going to say, thanks, Yana. I kept myself muted and just started talking. That does not work, guys. Someone asked, what are radiant heat-proof windows?
Right. So most of us have annealed glass windows as our primary windows that we look out of. But if we have a sliding glass door that's tempered glass, if you've ever tried to accidentally walk through a sliding glass door, you'll notice that it breaks differently. Tempered glass is a treatment that happens to windows themselves. And in the tempering process, which changed how it breaks, it also has increased its heat resistive properties 3 times greater than what annealed glass does overall. So tempered glass windows are a little more expensive, but where you're likely to have a radiant heat experience, upgrading to a window that's got that tempered glass would be a great best practice.
Great. Next question we're going to answer live. In planning for location of plants, how important is it to consider wind direction based on past wildfire history?
I mean, certainly what you know is worth trying to plan for, but I would, encourage you to think about vulnerabilities on all sides of the structure. I think it's easy to sort of forget about the backside because you don't look at it. There's maybe an ugly side of your house where you've got your garbage cans and various things stored. Be aware that fire can come in lots of different ways than you may be anticipating. And I think a lot of communities plan for the event they know and then miss the opportunity, miss recognizing that the event they don't know is the one that actually comes into their community. So be thinking about kind of an all approach.
Next question. Metal gate replacing a wood gate. Can it create radiant heat that contributes to combustion?
With use of the metal gate, no. And the why the 5 feet in the zone 0 approach, and that is because it's kind of an average between what roof overhangs tend to be on most homes. Some houses, I call them the haircut house, the severe haircut house, they have almost no eaves. And so, there's less vulnerability around those. Some houses have deep overhangs, in which case you'd want to go more than
Yeah,
you want to get out from underneath, because what you're trying to prevent is that eddying effect and where heat and embers get trapped underneath the eaves. So if you have a house with deep overhangs, then the gate should, and the metal structure, the connective point should be a little farther out than the full eve itself.
all right, last question. In our public education, should we start using the term fire adaptive more than fire wise or fire resistant?
That's a fantastic question, and I'd love some thought more from the full fire network. And Lania, if you're listening, I really like that kind of fire adaptive framework. I think it really is important to think about what we're trying to accomplish here. I've brought forward something that's really focused on communities and structures and how the interplay is between the landscaped environment and the built environment and how those two work with each other. For me, I'm really ultimately after trying to improve conditions overall so that we save lives, protect property, and really know that we can live in California with some security going forward. And so that's why, as much as I love plants and I grew up in a family of gardeners, like I am deeply a gardener at core, just trying to think more about that right plant, right place, right care framework, so that I can at least have a sense of security that if I don't get to go home during the evacuation, that my house was left in a condition where I feel okay about it, and that I know that I set up the house for the best possible outcome. And that also comes to play for being able to sell and market my house going forward. These kinds of features focused on defensible space and home hardening are now just as important as the remodeled kitchen, just as important of all those aesthetic things. The essential health of the structure and in the yard is just as marketable as all those other qualities. So lots to talk about, and I hopefully I've piqued your interest. I'm happy to continue to have conversation offline or in other events and other media and other forms through webinars and such as organized through our fire network. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for watching this training. UC Master Gardeners, please log 0.50 hours of continuing education in VMS.